Thank you all for coming to the Resiliency Lessons Learned in 2017 panel. I'm really excited about the panel that we have put together. If you don't know who I am, my name is Marissa Aho, and I am the Chief Resilience Officer for Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. And this is a role that I have been in as LA's first Chief Resilience Officer for a little over 2.5 years. And I'm very pleased to say this is my third year in a row here talking about resilience. And so I'm grateful that this is a subject matter that is important to this group and is something that we can talk about. So today we have a fantastic opportunity to hear from two fabulous people who have recently experienced the crises and disasters that sort of were weekly occurrences starting in the summer of 2017. And it felt like, at least for me, that every week there was another major disaster somewhere in the world, whether it be hurricanes or earthquakes or floods or fires or shootings or so on. And resilience really is not new, but this year I think all of the increasing frequency of these disasters has really helped to highlight why building resilience is incredibly important. And so I think our hope today is to talk a little bit about lessons learned from both Houston and Mexico City, and then to apply those lessons learned and also the resilience building that is currently occurring in California to give additional context for things that you all could be doing, or we and in our communities could be doing to build greater resilience and learn from and with communities who are experiencing these disasters, because in fact we know that it is not a matter of if but when our communities will be hit with a major disaster, and we want to be as prepared as possible. So with that, I will happily introduce both Sydney Bomer, Public Works and Engineering Operations Manager at Houston Water, and Arnaldo Mathis Kramer, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for Mexico City. And they're both going to give you a little bit of a day in their life, both sort of pre, during, and post-disaster in 5 minutes, and talk about any particular lessons learned to set the stage. And then we're going to ask you all to provide some questions quickly, and then in a bit we'll welcome our other two panelists to the stage and have a more in-depth conversation about sort of how these lessons can be applied to California and what we're doing here. So with that, I'm going to let Sydney go first.
I'll go up there or right here?
Either.
Oh, you hear me? Okay.
I'm flexible.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing? Start with this. I want to thank VerdeXchange for inviting the city of Houston Water, to this conference to let us tell our story about how Harvey impacted us. The newspapers and news feeds that you saw, it was very accurate. It was very bad and devastating on our city. We still have people, 300,000 homes, people are still recovering. The city itself is recovering infrastructure-wise. So what we do is during most hurricane events, Houston has a lot of tropical storms, rain events, hurricanes. So we have SOPs in place that we've had for decades. So we normally go around preparing our locations, reducing solids inventories, get our pumps, supplies, generators, and our personnel, get them located where they're going to be. Tier 1 people, our supervisors, our senior staff, and we get them prepared in the staging locations around the city. As you know, we have 39 wastewater treatment plants, 382 lift stations, and over 6,200 miles of sewer lines in the city of Houston. We ended up having 51.6 inches of rain during that event that hit Houston. Unfortunately, we lost 36 souls in our town, in our poor town. 104 altogether, but 36 just in Houston alone we lost. Our biggest asset was our people, of course. And out of the 39 plants, only 7 of them actually flooded. Now, the majority of the city did flood, almost the entire city. No area was spared. It didn't matter where you lived, you weren't spared. But out of our 39 plants, only 7 actually flooded. I mean flooded. As you saw on the news, it was actually underwater, 7 of the plants. Of those 7 plants, 5 of them actually came back within a day to 3 to 4 days. They actually drained off. We were able to get in there and help get those plants back in line. The other plants were just ticking along, other than high wet wells, power outages here and there, but we were able to keep functioning along and keeping the service areas down as much as possible in those areas. So it had less impact on our citizens. Excuse me. So what helped us was we have service contracts that allow us to bring in expertise as far as blowers, pumps, switchgear, panels, whatever we need. We have service contracts in place that allow us to bring in these folks to help us. So one of our, sorry, sore throat. Some of the things that we ended up having problems with was our, well, let me take a quick sip, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me get it. All right, before I get ahead of myself. The last 2 plants took almost 2 weeks before we could actually access them. Because what happened is there's reservoirs on a certain side of town, Addicts and Barker reservoirs. The Army Corps of Engineers were forced to do a controlled release because both of these reservoirs were going to overflow or possibly collapse certain parts of it and then completely flood Houston and the surrounding communities. So what they did is they did a controlled release. Doing that controlled release, it flooded certain neighborhoods, and 2 of our plants became inaccessible for 2 entire weeks before we can even get in there. We actually had to go in by airboat. I had to have people bring me in to the plant by airboat. So I had to access these plants by airboat a couple of times just to get an assessment of what we're going to be dealing with. So I could take pictures and give our assessment to our management up to the mayor, let them know how bad it is. And of course, we did aerial flights so they could take a look-see. Once the plants come down, we bring in generators, pumps to get the plants going and relieve the service areas. And again, we use those service contracts to help us. Some of the things that we realized that were hindrances, lessons learned, was bringing plants back online. What we had is issue with our provider, energy provider. We actually have a liaison for us. The city of Houston has a liaison with CenterPoint. I don't know if y'all know CenterPoint Energy's like your provider out here. We're supposed to take priority over other areas. Well, that didn't happen as well as it should have. And we're fixing that part of the problem. So whenever we're out trying to bring a plant back online or a lift station back online, CenterPoint's usually supposed to be there to help us coordinate that effort. Well, that didn't happen as well as it could have. Another thing we ran into was fueling locations because so many areas were flooded. So what we are looking at in the future is how we're going to address that. So that's something we're going to do down the road. And one of those things, and the last was was chemicals. Many of these facilities need chemicals for disinfection before it hits the receiving stream. We actually, because even Interstate 10 was inaccessible, we had to have police escorts bring chemical loads into the plants through the neighborhoods because the police were actually blocking off every neighborhood. We had state folks, federal folks, county folks blocking off neighborhoods. People couldn't even get in their neighborhoods. So we ended up having to have police escorts. That took a minute because I actually had to call all the way up the chain just to get police escorts So we worked that out. What helped also is emergency POs that the mayor said, get it done. Whatever you need, get it done. We got it done. So one of our lessons learned is going future, we're going to consolidate plants. Out of 39 plants, we decided to put our CIP, capital improvement projects, on hold, or let them finish if they're already at the 90% or 60% of their design work. So now what we want to do, we're going to let them finish up, and we're going to take 12 of our facilities offline and consolidate them. Because the effort is to make regional plants. We're going to get away from so many facilities and reduce our facilities. By doing so, our goal is to do this within 7 years, take these 12 plants offline. So what we've done in this effort, we're also going to, we partnered with, which was brought up at WEFTEC, if some of you guys were in Chicago, we brought it up that we were going to start an innovation hub. And we're going to bring in that new technology to help us with this effort. So our collaborators are Accelerate H2O. They're a nonprofit technology, an initiative firm formed to address barriers and limitations innovation. Our partners in this effort is going to be Rice University, University of Houston, Texas Water Institute, and NASA. NASA is coming in to help us with this effort. We also have we have an advisory technology team that we're bringing in to help us with this effort also as we consolidate and start new innovations in our city. So we brought in WERF, Water Environment Reuse Federation with LIFT. Some of you guys may know what that is. Water Research Foundation, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Bluefield Research, Corello Engineers, and Isle Utilities. They're helping us with the technology side of this. So we're looking forward to bringing folks in, and they're going to do 5 to 7 innovation projects annually. So that's our goal, to work with Accelerate H2O and the universities, and come out with reports and share them with everyone once it's done. That's it. Thank you
Very much.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
know it's hard to do quickly. Trust me. Arnaldo, now this task is up to you.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Marisa, for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you. And I think it's I don't know how much you know from history from Mexico City, but in '85 we suffered our largest natural disaster related to an earthquake. More than 10,000 people died. And so you can have two perspectives. So one is the comparison between the two earthquakes, and to see how have we improved. I mean, from the 1985, we didn't have even a civil protection system in place. Today, there is a national civil protection system. We have a ministry for civil protection within the city. All the boroughs have also a civil protection people. We have a control room. So the city has changed a lot, and building codes, for example, help a lot to reduce damages and deaths. I mean, this time, the earthquake, the fatalities were around 280 people died, which in comparison is not, it's a minor disaster, right? The city really was on track again with normal activities 1 week after, and it's just certain neighborhoods which are still struggling from the collapse of the buildings, or several hundred buildings that their structure have been damaged. Saying that, there were many issues related to this earthquake that confront us. One, it was related to our early warning system. We have established a very robust early warning system within the city, which is linked to loudspeakers across the city. And if we have an earthquake coming from the Pacific, we have around 1 minute to 1.5 minute time to evacuate buildings or to be in a safer place within a building. And people are nowadays used to it because we practice every year, 2 or 3 times per year, evacuations, or where in the building you have to be situated in order to reduce damages, fatalities, injuries. But this time, the earthquake didn't come from the Pacific. It was a nearby epicenter that, in fact, the early warning system started sounding when we already were shaking. So there was no time for that. In a way, it was also, it was the anniversary of the earthquake. It was 31 years after the same day. And so that was really curious. Actually, one day before, I was with the mayor in New York City announcing the creation of the Resilience Agency. And so very quickly we passed from theory to practice. And that's, he was mentioning this. And so now it's the kind of the reconstruction recovery phase. We have this program we call the reconstruction, recovery, and transformation into a more resilient city. So resilience is now like a kind of a fashion word, but really what does it mean? What does it mean for Mexico City? We are lucky that we really have worked on our resilience strategy for the last 3 years. And so we released our resilience strategy in September 2016. So we have a resilience strategy, a resilience agenda. Today we have a resilience agency. But there are tensions between the recovery process and what it means to transform the city into a more resilient city. And there are tensions because from one side you have people that suffered from the collapse of their buildings or from structural damage of their buildings, which they are now displaced. So there is a popular demand to have as fast as possible the rebuilding process. And that's pressure for many civil servants that are responsible for that. At the same time, in order to transform the city, and once you have identified the key stresses and the key risks within a city, you need to involve into a long-term planning process. So there are tensions between these short-term response needs and this long-term thinking to transform the city. And I think there are two issues where you can see these very easily. And one is, any one of you that know Mexico City, you know that we suffer from horrific traffic jam. And our mobility system, it's really a stress for our citizens. But at the same time, we have a very strong community on sustainable mobility. And I think we have done a really good effort to establish a framework on the regulation side, but also in certain areas like the BRT system of Mexico City, Ecobici, which is our sharing bike scheme, and to start moving into towards development oriented to transport, which means the promotion of massive transportation and how it relates to higher densities within the city. So today, within the formal city, one way to reconstruct and it's to increase density. So we have this new law for the reconstruction, so where any building that was with structural damage that needs to be retrofitted or recovered, it's allowed to increase 35% of its densities, just to finance the process of the reconstruction process. But in order to build resilience, we need also to think that those densities need to go in the direction that we identify of one of our main goals, which is that should be close to a massive transport system. So, and that's still, we will see if that happens. If not, we may, instead of decrease the stress of mobility, increase it. And so that's one. And the other is related to water. I mean, the city is already a very water-stressed city. So Many neighborhoods complain when you are building higher densities about, well, how are we going to get access to water? It's not an easy issue because, well, you need to provide good services, and that's long-term planning. And so we are facing those difficulties, like how we create a system where you have the long-term planning in place, you respond at the same time quickly for those people that are vulnerable for the earthquake today. And so we have these two issues within the administration. And I will also finish with one of the most important issues, which is Mexico City, as most other developing cities, have a large part of the population living in an informal city. So in Mexico City, more than 40% of all the construction are self-constructions without following any building code. So when I'm in meetings with discussing about like the reconstruction process, we just passed the new building codes to improve to improve like the resistance for any earthquake. But I'm always asking, okay, that's helpful for half of the city, but what about the other half part of the city? I mean, which usually is the poorest neighborhoods. And that creates like an area for innovation, for creativity, because it doesn't work with the same rules, with the same policies. They don't apply. That's where the Resilience Agency wants to have a higher focus on those vulnerable communities where we have informal settlements, and how we can support those communities, which are the most vulnerable and the ones that have the most needs. And I think that's a question in many other cities around the world. And it's not so clear how the system, the capital system, is responding to this half of part of the population. And I would conclude with that.
Thank you both. While Naomi and Russell are headed up here to join us, I will ask you both one question, and that is, given the urgency and given the scope and scale of these challenges, how do you prioritize?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I guess I'll go, how do we prioritize? We do it with our regional partners, and I would say we do it with the state, with the county, and we look at our flood control, for us, our flood control districts, to see how we're going to address long-term. It's our regional partners in the Innovation Hub, how we're going to go forward, and then through that, we'll be able to set priorities and how we want to address each area of the town, of the city of Houston, for us.
Well, I think our resilience strategy did that work already for us, because we have previously already identified earthquake risk as one of our major challenges, but we had a multi-hazard approach. So this was a participatory process involving the universities, the scientific community, NGOs, the private sector, all ministries within the city, the federal government. So we did that already. We prioritized where are our needs for the next years, and our vision was towards 2040. So it's more like how much a new condition or a new disaster adjusts your agenda. And I think in that sense, for sure, our agenda has been transformed. I mean, this year we will devote most of our energy for the reconstruction process. But we need to keep in mind that we have a resilience strategy, and that the reconstruction process should not goes against our other long-term goals within the city. And that's an exercise that that needs a lot of data, and a lot of analysis, and a lot of communication with a bunch of different stakeholders, and this is difficult in a city where you have a very large informal city, because informality means also that the lack of information and the lack of public servants and being there in those communities. So that's a challenge.
Fantastic, thank you. So we are thrilled to be joined by Naomi Kelly, City Administrator for the City of San Francisco and County of San Francisco, and Russell Fortmeyer of Arup. Trying to condense a very complicated discussion into no minutes. Naomi, so the state of California has at least 5 chief resilience officers in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Berkeley, and Santa Monica. And those cities and others have been working to increase resilience in advance of a major disaster. And I know that my office and your staff work regularly to share best practices of what we're doing. Can you summarize everything that you guys are doing in, about 5 minutes?
Let me try. So it was fun when 100 Resilient Cities got started, because we'd been thinking about resilience since the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And so we have been doing a lot. And I was thinking about the late Mayor Ed Lee when he was city administrator. Hurricane Katrina happened. And he went to New Orleans and went to the Broadmoor neighborhood literally right after that happened, and met with then community activist LaToya Cantrell, who just recently elected mayor of New Orleans. And out of that came so much of what's happening today in San Francisco. Out of that, we started, former city administrator, late Mayor Ed Lee, started our 10-year capital plan, where we're looking at all of our public assets and how do we get them. First, we must adhere with all the regulatory laws, but then how do we make sure that they're seismically retrofitted and that they're safe over the next 10 years, and doing a hazardous analysis of all of our police stations, fire stations, water systems, sewer systems, all of the above, comprehensive. And then he started a Lifelines Council, where to Hurricane Harvey right of the way, you can't have all these public and private utilities talking to each other for the first time, because you don't know who's the right person to make these decisions. And we have in the room, and usually the regulatory agency is suing the private agency, and we needed to put that aside, and we're in this together because we're all impacted together. We're independently connected to one another. And this is a great forum where PG&E, AT&T, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, the Municipal Transportation Agency, all the operations people, not the government and regulations folks, are in there saying, here are my assets. They may be vulnerable if an earthquake happens, or if there's flooding, or if there, God forbid, a terrorist attack. Here's what we need, and if something should go out, here are the things we need immediately. Fuel. Who gets priority to the fuel? We need power. How do we get the power up and running? We need our road and access cleared. And nowadays, I need the Wi-Fi and cell coverage up, because all of my assets, I'm on a handheld device, and I need to know where I need to go and how do I communicate with each other. And all of that has to happen immediately. So we had an interdependency study, and now we're in the next step in doing restoration timeline for how fast should we get certain assets up now. Also, we started the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, where we realized, as in Hurricane Harvey and Katrina and Sandy, that government won't get to you first, may not get to you first. So how do you create these resilient neighborhoods where your neighbors all know each other? And in big cities, it's not like small towns where all the neighbors know each other, but in big cities, you could be living next door to someone and you don't even know who they are. How do you create that sense of neighborhood so you are looking out for each other, and that the grocery store down the street is resilient so that you can get food, or that someone has a boat or a raft to come save you? Fostering those relationships and thinking about emergency preparedness. And then also after Hurricane Katrina, the city of San Francisco is self-insured, and we realized maybe we should take out a little bit more insurance to cover some of our vulnerable assets. And literally yesterday I was meeting with the Consulate General of London, who brought a whole bunch of insurance agencies in, as we were talking about, you should also be trying to help us solve for some of these problems, and definitely working with our insurance partners. Out of Sandy, one of the areas that we focused on was housing, right? Because we not just resilience, but recovery, and making sure that how do how do we keep our residents in San Francisco? And the more wealthy ones will probably be okay, but our most vulnerable residents, how do we get back our housing? So we worked on a report with Professor Doug Allers out of Harvard University, and they really studied what happened with Sandy and FEMA's program on the Rapid Response Program for housing. And we have a plan, we're starting to look at a plan in place, first, keep our residents in their neighborhood, if not in their home, if not in their home, in their neighborhood, if not in their neighborhood, in San Francisco, before we start looking and hopefully not to displace any residents. So we're looking and have a plan of action there to look at housing. Out of San Francisco's 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, Christchurch, New Zealand, Mexico City, we started an earthquake safety implementation program. So on the public side, we've got our capital plan looking to seismically retrofit all of our public assets, but we got a lot of private assets in the city. And so in the Loma Prieta earthquake, it was all our soft story homes, 5-story buildings with a big garage underneath that collapsed in the Marina district that had the big fire that everyone saw on TV. And a lot of homes in San Francisco are that building. So we had a mandatory soft story retrofit process, which we're actively going through right now and almost have completed. We also in San Francisco have a lot of private schools. Many of the families there send their kids to private school. The public schools had already, through the state of California, retrofitted all the public schools, but our private schools had not been, or could have been. We didn't know. So we mandated a private school evaluation, not the retrofit, just the evaluation. But as you can imagine, if the school is required to do evaluation and the parents realize that school is not seismically safe, there's that natural demand by the parents to get that school retrofitted. I know firsthand, my son's at a Catholic school in San Francisco, and then we are now actually retrofitting that school where my 2 sons are. Mexico City, the big collapse, was a school in non-ductile concrete. And so that's our next area of working groups where we're working to look at what do we do for it. And that's huge because it's private. Some of the landowners are on fixed income. What do we do? We're working with financing, but we have to address it because non-ductile concrete is brittle and could collapse within an earthquake. And then also we're looking at tall buildings as we have many skyscrapers, some very internationally famous that are sinking and probably tilting, looking at looking at our building codes when it comes around tall buildings. I'm actually more worried about the non-ductile concrete than our tall buildings in San Francisco. The press may be all over that and say, how could you? But there's a lot of engineers looking at that tall building. Non-ductile concrete is, as you can see in Mexico City, was the stuff that I kind of stay up at night, and if I had a magic wand, I would be fixing that right away. And last, there's so much more that we're doing. We think about this all the time, but I'll end with the Sonoma fire and Napa fire, a disaster recovery framework. That is so important to have. We are actively drafting that right now because Sonoma did not have that. And what is occurring, and this goes to the recovery and resilience of your neighborhood after it's just been devastated, without a disaster recovery framework, you had FEMA coming in wanting to clean up the Coffee Park neighborhood. And I've read about this in reports and heard about it anecdotally from Sonoma leaders. FEMA wants to come in and clean up the Coffee Park neighborhood in Sonoma. The residents there are like, oh, no, because they're unsure with insurance claims and FEMA claims. Don't touch, don't come in and clean, because you will take away my foundation, which is the only thing that's left, the foundation and the chimney. And if you take away my foundation and chimney, I will not be able to rebuild there. And so I'm not going to let FEMA come in. And now what is happening is residents are building in the exact same spot instead of a thoughtful rebuild of that Coffee Park neighborhood. And then the other thing that has happened is the vacuum of not having a disaster recovery framework, a nonprofit that with no connections to the elected officials of Sonoma or have any stakeholder community process or neighborhood process established and said, we're gonna do the disaster recovery. And FEMA's like, fine, because this was who got out there and saying they're gonna do it, but maybe that's not what the elected officials want or the community wants or the neighborhood association wants. So it's important to have that in place because you want to know who's in charge, who's making these decisions and what's the decision-making process before an event happens, so that it is well informed by the folks who live in the community and not a nonprofit who you may or may not know who's part of that nonprofit. And so a disaster recovery framework is very important, again, to setting priorities, making decisions, someone that is a vetted process ahead of time. Those are my comments.
Thank you. I really appreciated everything that you said because, as most folks know, we're doing a lot of that in Los Angeles, and I'm usually the one going through the long list of everything that we're doing. So, fantastic. Russell, I think I'm going to put you on the spot earlier than planned.
I mean, there's nothing to respond to. I don't know.
Right?
There's nothing to work with here.
If you don't all feel the urgency, need, and sort of what how we need more partners working on this and looking at their role in resilience by now, I'm gonna encourage Russell and the panelists to talk about the importance of partnerships and maybe the private sector in our concluding remarks, because if you don't know, I keep to a schedule. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to go to the private sector really to make a comment because, I think in the work that ARIP does around resilience globally, it gives us a window in the way it's practiced in a lot of different cities. And I think the way we approach it is really thinking it through as a system, and it is a process. And it's only through kind of a systems approach do you look at all of the ways that I think we've heard from our panelists that these very kind of isolated issues start to ripple through all these different sectors. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear Naomi talk about the private school versus the public school, and just a lot of just assumptions we all make that a school is a safe place in California. And it's, we have a lot of charter schools here in Los Angeles that would operate in a different world than, say, a public school. And so it's such a timely question. And I think immediately post-disaster, I mean, in all of these cities, ARIP works and have built a number of buildings in each of these cities, and the first thing we always do after these disasters is we go and we check in on our clients, and we do building surveys of what, how do the clients' properties and assets fare through that disaster? What do they need? What's their plan to get back on track immediately? And I think it seems to be those kinds of lessons learned, or those opportunities are a way for the private sector to liaise with cities, to try and figure out ways to short circuit that recovery time. I mean, I'm really fascinated, Sydney, with the innovation hub idea that creating an opportunity for people to come together and engage, I think is so important. And I know there are limitations to some of the frameworks that are out there around resilience. You and I have talked about some of the limitations around the city's resilience index that a lot of that these cities have adopted to sort of measure their resilience, if that's possible. But I think what's so important about that is that it creates, through those frameworks, you create these opportunities for conversation. And so maybe if we have time to ask a question of the panel, I would just be curious, out of the events that you've had, what conversations emerged around gaps, either between agencies or between agencies and the private sector? And you mentioned the schools gap in San Francisco. I'm curious on the in Houston, from the water perspective, were there critical facilities that were just completely left out of the loop in terms of needing a higher priority to get back in line? Like the two water treatment plants that took a couple of weeks to get back in line, how did that ripple out into that community, and were there conversations that emerged from that?
Oh, the gap in that, well, is I guess the Army Corps of Engineers, we needed to work better relationship with them, which we did. We have a Harris County Emergency Center. They work with our county judge and with our mayor and surrounding mayors and judges. And I think that coordination should have been a little better. Yeah, we're looking to improve that. Both of those reservoirs are being looked at. They're even talking, there's 20 projects future projects on the line that our state legislature is looking at to help us fund and get those jobs done. Even one of them could even be an additional reservoir. They're looking at building a third reservoir, making the current ones deeper, and maybe even start releasing earlier than what they did to reduce that. So those conversations are going on. And the other part would be our power grids. We're looking at most of our facilities maybe need 2 power sources to feed that particular plant. So if one side goes down, the other side can take over. Electricians come in, flip over to the other side. So we're still running. Service areas, citizens are still trucking along. They're happy campers. We're looking at our on-site power generation, have generators on the plant sites ready to go. So those are some of the things we're looking at that were gaps that we may future-wise, and part of the Innovation Hub can help fix that part for us.
I guess the follow-up question to that, maybe for all 3 of you, I don't know who would want to jump in. Have you seen the private sector adopt technologies or implement technologies to make up for the impacts from those disasters? In other words, have you seen the private sector install black water treatment plants and start to look at distributed water treatment?
Well, we did what the mayor did and the public works director. We actually had private folks come in with package plants. Mm-hmm. And we stationed them around the areas to help us process the water, so we can help bring some relief to those service areas where it was most impacted. We even brought in private companies to help us, and their idea was, well, if you got these plants working in this side of town, well, they put in pumps in manholes or wherever we could, and we pumped to another service area to relieve that area. So outside partnerships did help us in a lot of areas, and that's only going to grow and grow and grow.
I can talk about more on the sea level rise aspect of it. We're doing a lot of competitions working with Rebuild by Design. Just talked about it before, where they're coming up with innovative ideas on how to deal with whether we adapt or retreat in certain neighborhoods, and innovative ideas. And maybe this is the way to go, but it's out there, like floating villages or floating assets out there. And so we are partnering with the private sector to look at things in that nature. I know from the insurance side of it, just in response to earthquakes and whatnot, now if you're trying to get homeowners insurance or things of that nature, there's automatic shut-off valves that we may be putting in for our gas lines. If an earthquake hits a certain amount, that's not regulated by anything, but if you want the best premium or deductible, you will put that in your home and that's kind of moving, the private side working with government to kind of deal with disaster recovery and that nature. And yeah, we have many design, our tech industry is working we have a mayor's office of civic innovation that's working with different issues that come up in utilizing the tech and apps for us to kind of work with us.
Well, I would say that from one side, we are much more prepared at the institutional level to kind of have public-private partnerships for disaster recovery. But one lesson coming out from the last earthquake is that there is still a large gap into the planning on those partnerships. And one issue that emerged was also the use of social media in terms of kind of demanding certain requests in order to respond for different needs. But in 2-3 days, we have 5 or 4 different platforms that were developed by civil society or by private companies, all working at the same time. And there was an issue of verifying the information, because at some point, social media was reporting issues that happened 2 days before. So the demands were not verified and were not align on real time. That's an issue that I think is an emerging issue on how to make the best use of social media to coordinate, because it's a great tool, but it also misleading the information when you need really to verify that information. So that's a lesson, and that's something where I think the next steps is to be more prepared in terms of those partnerships with the private sector, but also with civil society, and also to go and think about the public space in terms of the design of the public space to be more useful for attending the emergency.
Can I respond to that one real quick? I think it's
Really quickly.
very quickly. That is exactly right. We have a chief digital security digital team that is working with our websites, because people are responding to social media and to websites very quickly on where to go, what to do. And our team went to Napa and Sonoma right after the fires to help those cities create a site for folks to find homes in partnering with Airbnb, and to get that interactive page help out immediately. So that is exactly right.
Yes, awesome. So this conversation could continue for days, and I hope it does. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and please ask them questions outside in the hall.